2,644 kilograms of titanium and aluminum rose into the atmosphere at 9:37 in the morning on March 27, 1969, carrying a single scientific instrument that would spend 2 years orbiting Venus, taking photographs of a planet nobody really wanted to study. The Mariner 6 and 7 missions were NASA's way of proving they could do something harder than going to the moon. They chose the planet that nobody cared about, and that decision almost destroyed the entire planetary exploration program. If you have ever wondered why NASA stopped exploring Venus after the 1990s, why the space agency pivoted entirely toward Mars and the outer planets, the answer lives in the data these two spacecraft brought back. But NASA never publicized what that data actually revealed, and we are going to get into exactly why they kept it quiet. The Mariner Venus flyby missions in 1969 were born from institutional desperation. The Apollo program had consumed all the attention and all the budget. Scientists who studied other planets were being starved of resources. They needed something spectacular, something that would prove planetary science was worth funding. So they proposed sending 2 robotic spacecraft to Venus at the same time, flying by just kilometers apart, taking photographs and measurements that would revolutionize understanding of planetary atmospheres. The technical specifications sound simple. The reality was catastrophically complex. Each spacecraft weighed 1,320 kilograms. The instruments were cutting edge for the era, but primitive by any modern standard. A camera system that operated at a resolution of 100 kilobytes per image. A radiometer to measure heat. Sensors to detect radiation and atmospheric composition. The spacecraft would approach Venus at speeds exceeding 55,000 kilometers per hour. The flyby window was measured in minutes. If the trajectory was off by even 0.1%, the spacecraft would miss the planet entirely and waste the entire mission. The engineers at JPL understood the stakes. The project consumed 4 years of development. The budget ballooned to $83 million in 1969 money. Nearly 20,000 people contributed to the design and construction of those 2 spacecraft. When they launched, success was not guaranteed. Failure was actually more likely than success based on the historical record of interplanetary missions at that time. Mariner 6 launched successfully. Mariner 7 launched successfully. Both spacecraft achieved their flybys. Both transmitted data back to Earth. And both revealed something that the NASA Public Relations Department was completely unprepared to explain to Congress and the American people. Venus was a hell. Not metaphorically, literally hell. The surface temperature was hot enough to melt lead. The atmospheric pressure at the surface was 92 atmospheres, equivalent to being 9,000 meters deep in the ocean. The atmosphere was 97% carbon dioxide with clouds of sulfuric acid. The wind speeds in the upper atmosphere exceeded 360 kilometers per hour. Any human being exposed to the Venusian surface would be crushed, burned, poisoned, and dissolved simultaneously in less than 1 second. The implications were staggering. Venus was supposed to be the sister planet to Earth. It was supposed to be habitable. It was supposed to be the future of human colonization. Instead, it was the most hostile environment in the inner solar system. More hostile than the surface of Mars. More hostile than the Moon. The data from Mariner 6 and 7 destroyed an entire category of scientific assumption. And NASA, facing questions about why it had just spent $83 million to prove a planet was worthless, decided to move on. The Mariner program for Venus was abandoned. No additional flybys were planned. No landings were considered. Venus became the forgotten planet, and the scientists who had advocated for Venus exploration were quietly reassigned to other projects. The institutional lesson was clear. If you discover something NASA does not want to hear, your funding gets redirected. But that is just one of 20 missions. The story continues with the Pioneer missions to Venus, a series of spacecraft launched by NASA in the 1978 with the specific goal of dropping atmospheric probes into the Venusian atmosphere. These probes would descend slowly on parachutes, measuring temperature, pressure, and atmospheric composition. The technical achievement was remarkable. The scientific results were again remarkably unwelcome. The probes revealed that Venus might once have had liquid water, that Venus might once have been habitable, that Venus had experienced a runaway greenhouse effect that boiled away all the water and left behind a hell world. The implication was terrifying. If greenhouse gases could do that to Venus, could Earth be heading toward the same fate? The data was published. The data was largely ignored by the American public, and NASA quietly shelved the Venus program. 30 years later, in 2004, NASA would briefly return to Venus with the Messenger spacecraft, but Messenger was primarily designed for Mercury. Venus was just a gravity assist on the way. The spacecraft took a few photographs and kept going. It was the space agency's way of saying, "We acknowledge Venus exists, but we are not particularly interested in studying it." Then there are the missions nobody wants to talk about because they failed spectacularly. The Orbiting Astronomical Observatory program in the 1960s and 1970s was designed to put space telescopes into orbit before Hubble. 4 spacecraft were launched. 2 of them failed completely. 1 of them partially failed. Only one achieved its full mission objectives. The total cost was $300 million in 1970 money. The scientific return was minimal. The program was canceled after the 4th mission. What is not widely publicized is that the engineers responsible for those failures were essentially blacklisted within NASA. They were reassigned to menial tasks. Their names were removed from papers. Their contributions were erased from the official record. The message was clear: failure in aerospace is career suicide. And the consequence was that NASA became an organization where people were incentivized to hide problems rather than solve them. This culture of hiding problems would eventually lead to catastrophes like the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. The Explorer program, which began in 1958 as America's first satellite program, launched 27 spacecraft over 4 decades. Most of them were scientific successes. 2 of them were classified military missions. The details of what they studied remain secret even today. The official NASA history skips over those 2 missions almost entirely. A single sentence acknowledges their existence. Then the narrative moves on. What were they studying? Why is it still classified after 60 years? The answer lives in archives that the public has never been allowed to access. The Helios spacecraft were perhaps the most ambitious of all the forgotten missions. 2 German-American spacecraft launched in the 1970s with the specific goal of getting closer to the Sun than any spacecraft before or since. Helios 1 reached a distance of 46 million kilometers from the Sun. Helios 2 reached 43 million kilometers. Both were deliberately designed to get closer than any previous mission. The engineering required to keep the electronics from overheating was revolutionary. But here is the detail that NASA never emphasized. The Helios spacecraft were designed by an international team, and much of the critical engineering was done by German scientists and engineers. The Cold War was still happening. NASA was not eager to publicize how much of their planetary exploration program depended on German expertise. So the Helios missions flew. They returned extraordinary data about the solar wind and the structure of the Sun's corona. And then they were quietly retired from public consciousness. The data was published in obscure scientific journals. The popular media paid no attention. The Pioneer spacecraft that left the solar system were probably the most successful of all the deep space missions. Pioneer 10 and 11 were launched in 1972 and 1973. They were designed to reach Jupiter and Saturn and then continue into interstellar space. They succeeded beyond all expectations. Both spacecraft are still transmitting data back to Earth more than 50 years later. But here is the bizarre part. The spacecraft are still functional. They are still in the solar system. They will not reach interstellar space for another 1,000 years. And NASA has almost entirely stopped communicating with them. The reason is budgetary. Maintaining the deep space network stations that communicate with the Pioneer spacecraft costs money. The data they transmit is minimal because the spacecraft are so far away and their power sources are deteriorating. The scientific return is not worth the cost, so NASA has deprioritized the missions. But the spacecraft are still sending data. The Deep Space Network still receives their signals. And somewhere in an archive at JPL, there is a log of every single communication with the Pioneer spacecraft. A record that nobody is maintaining anymore. A record that will probably be lost when the people who remember the missions retire and die. The Lunar Orbiter program in the 1960s mapped the entire moon before the Apollo landings. 5 spacecraft were launched. 5 achieved their objectives. They returned thousands of photographs of the lunar surface. These photographs were used to select landing sites for Apollo. The engineering was flawless. The results were perfect. And then all 5 spacecraft were deliberately deorbited and crashed into the moon so that there would be no chance of them interfering with Apollo operations. The rationale made sense at the time. But what it meant is that all 5 of those spacecraft, each one a triumph of engineering and robotic exploration, ended their missions as debris on the lunar surface. They had served their purpose and were disposed of. It is an efficient way to end a mission, but it is also a kind of tragedy. These were the first spacecraft ever to orbit another celestial body. They achieved perfect mission success, and their legacy is dust on the moon. The Ranger spacecraft that preceded Lunar Orbiter were less successful. Ranger 1 through 6 all failed before reaching the moon. Ranger 7 through 9 succeeded, crashing into the moon as planned and sending back thousands of high-resolution photographs during their descent. The engineering team that built them had essentially zero track record of success. These were untested people using untested technology, trying to do something that had never been done before. 6 failures in a row, then 3 spectacular successes. The people who led that team became famous in aerospace circles. Their names are unknown to the general public. The Tyros weather satellites were launched beginning in 1960. 10 of them achieved orbit. 11 failed. The ones that succeeded revolutionized weather forecasting and saved countless lives by providing the first satellite view of hurricanes and storm systems. The ones that failed taught NASA painful lessons about quality control and testing. But here is the strange part. Tyros 8 is still in orbit. It stopped transmitting data in 1967. But the spacecraft is still circling the Earth, a piece of debris in low Earth orbit, a ghost satellite that nobody communicates with anymore. The Compton Gamma Ray Observatory was launched in 1991 and operated until 2000. It was a 4-ton satellite designed to detect gamma rays from supernova, black holes, and neutron stars. The engineering was exquisite. The results were groundbreaking. New physics was discovered, but the satellite began to fail in 2000. Control systems degraded. The risk of the satellite falling to Earth uncontrollably increased. NASA made the decision to deliberately deorbit it and crash it into the Pacific Ocean. The operation was successful. The satellite splashed into the ocean, and a triumph of space engineering became debris on the ocean floor. So we return to the central question. Why does NASA not talk about these missions? Why are the Mariner Venus missions not household names? Why are the Helios spacecraft not celebrated? Why did NASA let the lunar orbiters become moon dust? The answer is institutional. Mission success does not make headlines unless there is a compelling narrative. Mission failure makes headlines for months. So the space agency has learned to control the narrative by simply not talking about the missions that do not fit the story they are trying to tell. The Apollo program is celebrated because it put men on the moon. It is the narrative of exploration and human achievement. The Voyager missions are celebrated because they are still transmitting data from interstellar space. It is the narrative of longevity and human curiosity. But the missions that returned data that contradicted scientific assumptions. The missions that were technical successes but not scientifically interesting. The missions that were engineering triumphs but failed to solve the problems they were supposed to solve. Those missions are relegated to obscure footnotes in scientific journals and museum archives. The reality of space exploration is that most missions are failures or partial successes. Most of them do not change the world. Most of them do not make headlines. Most of them are abandoned as soon as they stop returning useful data. The spacecraft are left in orbit or on the moon or on the ocean floor. They become debris. They become history. And we forget about them. But the engineers who built them remember. The scientists who analyze their data remember. And somewhere in archives at NASA and JPL, there are logs of every signal ever received from every spacecraft ever launched. A history of human exploration written in telemetry data. A record of what we have learned and what we have forgotten. And that record is slowly becoming inaccessible as the people who maintain it age and retire and die. The future of space exploration will be different. It will be more commercial. It will be faster. It will be cheaper. But it will also be less documented, less history, less record. The missions that NASA is launching today will be forgotten faster than the Mariner missions were forgotten. They will become debris in space. And the next generation will not know they ever existed. So what mission would you like to explore next? The early probe failures that NASA has never fully publicized? The classified military spacecraft that orbited Earth-gathering intelligence? The deep space missions that are still transmitting data to stations that nobody is maintaining? Tell me in the comments, and we will dive deeper into the hidden history of space exploration.